Hello. Today, we're going to talk about a new way to think about the nature of scene perception using a framework to understand the computational architecture of selective processing. This framework enables us to capture two foundational aspects of scene perception: the automaticity of processing navigational affordances and flexible multigranular geometry representations. I'm Marr Belledonne. These are my collaborators Yihan Bao and Ilker Yildirim. Let's get started. What do we see in a scene? Here, our scene percept contains several kinds of representations: the overall boundary of the environment, a set of objects and agents of interest, and how we can get to them. Importantly, not all scene geometry is represented equally. For example, it is unlikely that each pew is distinctly encoded in our conscious percept. Or consider this outdoor scene on a hiking trail. In a sense, there is so much to see in this complex visual environment: the rocks, the trees, the scattering of the light, but at the same time, as one is navigating, not all of these things enter our percepts in the same way. For example, do you see this patch of rocks on the left in the same way you see this patch of rocks on the right? Each of these patches are similar in terms of their texture and distance to the observer, yet we experience these patches differently. They matter to a different extent in terms of the path that would take you forward on this trail, and perhaps this context drives perceptual mechanisms to selectively process one patch over the other. These examples highlight how scene perception is highly selective. Many changes in a scene go unnoticed if those changes occur during a blinker or saccade, but at the same time, scene perception supports ecologically critical functions such as navigation, which requires a detailed analysis of scene geometry, including paths to points of interest and the obstacles along the way. In this work, we explored selective processing in the context of indoor scenes, like this room. Here, as an observer standing at the entrance, you can see the walls, the exits across the room, and a collection of blue cuboids that we refer to as the furniture residing in between. But again, do you see each of these elements in the same way? In other words, what determines what representations over this scene enter our percepts, and how can we formalize this selective processing? Starting from an influential approach, David Marr's theory of vision describes how input images, represented initially in terms of a primal sketch of edges and contours, are converted to viewpoint-specific 2.5D surface features, and then ultimately to 3D object-based representations. In terms of the modern toolkit available in computer vision, we can implement Marr's theory using Bayesian inference over generative models that describe how scenes form and project onto images, through a process known as analysis by synthesis. So what's missing in this picture? Well, in a way, basically everything critical about scene perception. First, scene perception is highly selective, meaning that perceptual representations are a lot more flexible or deeper than just having a monolithic sense of 3D geometry. And second, scene perception supports ecologically important functions such as navigation and search. But in Marr's theory, there is no principled analysis of the role of implicit or explicit goals in perception. Perhaps not surprisingly, these elements turn out to be quite interrelated. To capture the flexibility and depth of perception, we will introduce multigranular representations over geometry. But the proposition of multigranularity in perception immediately begs the question of what level of resolution should perception choose to represent different aspects of the world. And this is where the idea of goal-driven processing comes into play. This is not a novel idea, in fact stemming from the inception of cognitive psychology back in 1967. However, this theory has never been codified in a computational framework, especially in the domain of perception. Here, part of our work is to formalize such goal-driven processes in perception by characterizing how implicit or explicit goals can drive the formation of a percept, by adaptively allocating representational as well as computing resources. Our objective is to develop a computational framework that formalizes how and why goals, or what we want to do in the world, influence the allocation of internal resources over what we can perceive in the world. The remainder of this talk is structured as follows. First, we will present a new computational model that integrates attention and perception, and then we will test predictions from this model in a psychophysical experiment. And finally, we will conclude with future directions. Now onto our modeling approach, an adaptive computation model of scene perception that is based on a new way to think about attention in computational terms. We normally think of hypothesis testing in the context of higher level thought, but here we use it to describe a process that characterizes attention such that it guides perception to selectively process the world in a goal-driven manner. This framework consists of 4 general modules, which will apply in turn to the domain of scene processing. The first step involves a perception module that transforms input images to a scene state over geometry. We implement beliefs over scene geometry using Bernoulli probabilities of furniture existent, which represent the observer's confidence over which tiles contain obstacles. But as previously mentioned, we hypothesize that scene geometry does not exhibit uniform resolution in terms of representation, but instead varies across in a coarse-to-fine encodings of geometry. Using what we call spatial trackers, which evenly divide the scene, these Bernoulli probabilities are anchored to the spatial boundary of their respective trackers. Through trackers, resolutions are determined independently across distinct spatial regions, enabling a heterogeneous spread of geometry representations across the scene. Focusing on an individual tracker, at the coarsest level, the entire subspace of the tracker is defined by one Bernoulli latent, that is upsampled when mapped to the tracker's respective cells in the scene state. Intermediate level trackers map onto the scene state in a similar fashion. Finally, the most refined trackers form a one-to-one relationship with scene state, with each latent in the tracker corresponding to an address in the scene state. Here, you can see that across trackers all of these resolutions are present simultaneously for this particular hypothesis over the scene. But how can we calculate likelihood given this multi-resolution representation? With the stochastic nature of the scene state, the likelihood over image is derived as an empirical distribution arising from multiple instantiations sampled from the scene state. Each instance is rendered by the generative model and collectively define the mean and variance of a multivariate normal distribution over the image space. Here, multigranular tracker representations form a principled link between representational resolution and uncertainty in predictions. Moreover, just as tracker resolution can vary from one region to the next, so can the variance term of the likelihood. The second module of our framework involves formalizing the ecological end of perception through a collection of mental processes that think, plan, or search over the scene representations provided by perception. Here, we propose that humans automatically process scene representations in the service of a set of implicit goals such as navigating through a room. We represent the knowledge extracted from scene geometry as navigational affordances, or the probability that a tile lies along the shortest path from the current location of the observer, highlighted in green, to the exit, highlighted in red. In this work, we assume that the observer can accurately encode these two locations. Similar to the likelihood, instances sampled from the room state were passed through a planner to build an empirical distribution over navigational affordances. In this implementation, we used a simple path planning algorithm to find all shortest paths over a lattice graph representing the free trials in each instance. Step 3 of 4 in this framework is to implement task-driven hypotheses about the goal relevance of each tracker's content. The key to this step is to quantify how much goal-driven beliefs, such as navigational affordances, change as a function of incremental improvements to tracker representations. On the left is the ground truth scene geometry, and this is the inferred scene state for that step. Remember that we have these trackers that evenly divide up the scene and guide inference about the granularity in geometry. We use sensitivity analysis from information theory to quantify how much navigational affordances would change as a result of incremental improvements on a given tracker. You can see that these improvements can lead you to large or small changes in navigational affordances, corresponding to high and low sensitivity respectively. Here, for example, sensitivity analysis reveals that intuitively trackers along the general path to the exit are significantly more goal relevant than other trackers. These sensitivity scores determine how much the model attends to each tracker. And now my collaborator Yihan will tell us about the final module in the framework that takes these scores as input.
Thanks, Mario. So the final module in our framework selectively attends to each tracker via adaptive computation. It specifies how these goal-driven hypotheses drive the computation of a percept. In this module, computational and representational resources are distributed across trackers in the form of Bayesian beliefs updates of two flavors. The first flavor describes the allocation of representational resources to form alternative hypotheses over tracker granularity. We evaluate this hypothesis using reversible jump MCMC moves between the finer and coarser spatial granularities. The second flavor describes the allocation of computing cycles to guide a random walk over obstacle probabilities within a given resolution level. It is well known that the inverse graphics is a notoriously difficult inverse problem. Inspired by recent work building inference networks, we incorporated the bottom-up module, taking the form of a variation autoencoder to initialize our MCMC chain as a data-driven proposal function. Here, we train the autoencoder to reconstruct the images and uses its learned latent space to also decode the scene state with a second decoder. As you can see, the resulting proposals are far from 100% accurate. They are in fact in some ways impoverished. Yet, these proposals provide a reasonable starting point for inference that would be otherwise computationally difficult to achieve with purely traditional Monte Carlo method. Thus, this system provides an example of how discriminative bottom-up processes can seamlessly interact with inference over complex generative models with multi-granular representations.
Thank you, Yihan. This framework predicts that selective processing over multigranular geometry representations in scene perception arise from automatic or spontaneous computation of navigational affordances during passive viewing. We're going to test this framework in a psychophysics experiment that will provide us an objective measure of human performance. Here, we implement a change detection paradigm to evaluate the automaticity of navigational affordances in scene perception. If scene geometry is selectively processed in the service of efficiently computing navigational affordances, then humans should more readily detect changes in geometry that result in a difference in shortest paths relative to changes in geometry that do not impact those shortest paths. Here, I'm showing an example of a same shortest path trial, where the change in geometry highlighted in yellow does not lead to a change in shortest path. To address potential confounds with changes in geometry leading to salient visual cues that might bias hit rate independently of goal-driven processing, when creating different path trials, all we do is move the door, such that the change in geometry now affects the shortest path while keeping all other changes constant. Let's take a bird's eye view of these two trials to better see the shortest paths. I am again highlighting the change in geometry in yellow, but we are now also showing the aggregate of all shortest paths using this green color. You can now see that this is a same path pair where the change in geometry does not impact the navigational affordances. Contrast this to a different path example where we apply the exact same modification to geometry, but this time it impacts navigational affordances. We predict that people will more readily detect the change in geometry when it matters for navigation. We generate a set of 32 unique scene pairs, resulting in 64 control trials that had no change in geometry, 32 trials that had a change in geometry that did not result in a difference in shortest paths, and 32 trials that had a change in geometry that resulted in a difference in shortest paths. As we predicted, we found that the number of changes successfully detected are significantly higher when that change accompanied a difference in shortest paths. Now that we've reported some evidence suggesting that the presence of selective processing in scene perception, let's turn to the model to explain how much differences in paths would increase hit rate for matched trial pairs as a function of attention. Here we can see that our model captures much of the explainable variance in the data, and this R-squared approaches consistency between the responses of our subjects. While the design of the stimuli pairs between same versus different path trials already minimize the pixel level differences, we can more directly test whether residual changes in pixels are able to predict behavior. Consistent with our design, pixel level changes are unrelated to behavior. In conclusion, we provide evidence for an implicit task of navigation influencing scene perception, that humans spontaneously process shortest paths in the scene. More generally, we introduce a new model of goal-driven selective processing that integrates attention and perception. Finally, this work opens up in future directions that we are very excited about, including understanding the division of labor in the human scene network in computational terms of this framework, investigating and integrating multigranularity more deeply throughout the model, and finally, using more expressive or diverse set of paradigms to study behavior, including memory and search. Thank you for your attention.